Okay, well, welcome everybody. This is Champions for Earth 2023. We've got Dr. Aaron Thierry, climate communications expert. Super happy to have you here. Aaron, over to you.
All right, thank you, Etienne. Hi, everyone. Yep, so I've been asked to come and speak tonight to kind of just give you some of the kind of backgrounds on how to have a productive climate communication. And I've got a background in climate Earth system science myself. I did a PhD in ecology about 10 years ago, and then since then I've worked for various different organizations, including NGOs and so on. I'm currently doing a PhD at Cardiff University in the climate movement, studying how people understand about climate change and how we can get more people active to take action. Without further ado, I'll kind of launch in. The key takeaway, I guess, is just to try everything and experiment. We have to try and end the silence that there is in society around talking about climate change in everyday life. And I think we all have a role to play in that. And as Etienne said in the introduction, you know, you don't have to be an expert, you don't have to be a scientist to be able to talk about these things. In fact, actually, the more just ordinary people or people you know, who have a role in any particular community take a lead in talking about these issues and what we can do, the better. So the takeaway from the talk, really, if you don't pay any attention to anything else I say, is just have conversations about climate change and experiment with how they go. In terms of an overview of the kind of things that I'm just going to cover in the talk, firstly, kind of how do we frame climate change? How do we think about climate change? How do we, you know, what topics do we tend to associate it with? What's the audience? This is going to focus a little bit more on the UK, but, you know, how do we know who we should be aiming our communications to? And then I'm going to do a very brief Climate Science 101, kind of covering some of the key things that is helpful to know about the basic science. And then if we've got time, I'm going to cover a bit about a communications strategy called the story of self, which helps us communicate why we're to take action. So if you were just to go onto Google and type in climate change, what comes up, right? So I did this earlier on, and what came up was this, right? And it's quite a distant kind of view of what the issue is, right? You have these pictures of the planet. They tend to be, you know, in this case, you know, quite explosive, like the planet blowing up. You know, you've got distant pictures of polar bears and icebergs, or graphs and maps and so on. If you keep looking, you can find lots of different charts and data, and it tends to be discussed in quite a kind of scientific, technical kind of language, and people kind of often struggle with this. And actually, you know, most people don't necessarily know how to read a graph and understand what it means easily. So, you know, it tends to be seen as quite a nerdy kind of topic. You know, that you have to have a skill set in science to understand, and we need to kind of break that down and really broaden the conversation and take it outside of that space. One of the things that kind of comes up a lot is, you know, if you look at imagery around climate change, are pictures like this. So, you know, environmental pictures of events such as wildfires or glaciers breaking up, or landscapes like this dried lake bed or field or whatever, that kind of are there to signify our fears around climate change. All of these, I think, are helpful in terms of, like, they do describe some of the things that are happening, but they also, again, only show some of why we should be interested or concerned about climate change. And again, they keep a distance between us and what's happening. You know, this is happening to places far away in the Arctic, or, you know, other parts of the world that aren't necessarily here at home. So one of the things that we really need to do as climate communicators is trying to shorten that psychological distance between the changes that are happening and the things that we care about. So if we were to go a bit further, I think this is starting to then really think about climate change in terms of what it means for people. And, you know, whether or not that's the flooding that's affecting people, or the heat waves, or the storms, or the droughts affecting agriculture, and ultimately the crops that grow the food that we depend upon. It's bringing it back to making it clear, joining the dots, connecting the dots between the changes in our environment and what it means for us. And I think one of the key things that I kind of encourage people to do when they're talking about climate change is to help connect these dots. But it doesn't have to necessarily be a negative story that we're telling. And I think that, a lot of climate communications, has traditionally focused on the things that we're trying to avoid, and the things that we have to, the reasons that we need to take action. And obviously that's an important part of the story. But it can also be disempowering if we don't know what to do about it. So it's really important that, again, we talk about, the ways in which action can be taken, is being taken, and the positive future that could help build. So again, by putting people back in the picture and saying, these are the things that we could be getting on with, getting stuck in with, that then helps us all imagine how we can participate in building the future that we want to bring about, the low carbon sustainable future that we all have to reach. So partly in our communications, again, we want to take a kind of mix both the kind of a recognition of our anxieties and concerns about the need to take action and what we want to avoid, but also talk about these things that we can do and what we want to build towards. In terms of, I think, roles that athletes and sports people can talk about, is recognizing that actually, you all have communities yourselves. You're all part of networks, clubs, organizations. You have people who perhaps look up to you and so on, who'd be willing to listen to what it is that you have to say. And so hopefully part of the reason that you're interested in Champions for the Earth is to figure out how to use your voice, your platform, in order to help mobilize people to take action. So I think going back to this kind of idea about connecting the dots, I think one of the ways we can do that is by talking about the ways in which climate change are impacting sports events themselves, and helping kind of make sense to people why it is that you as an athlete are perhaps concerned about the changes. Now, obviously, the changes that are happening, there are not just about this, right? So it's just kind of a hook that we can use to help start having a conversation. So here we have a picture from the Australian Open in 2014, where it was extremely hot that summer. As climate change is getting hotter, we know that we're getting more of these extreme heat events, and so really strong heat waves like this are going to happen more and more regularly, and obviously that makes it hard to perform sporting at a high level in those temperatures. We're also seeing things like floods affecting stadiums and football pitches, and increasingly again, that could happen at any level, right? So we know that as climate change is warming the planet, it's causing more water vapor in the atmosphere, which then can fall out as heavier rainfalls and more extreme flooding events happen as a result. So again, talking about how this is affecting stadiums and so on can help fans understand why climate change is having a direct impact on their lives. Another example of how climate change is affecting people is through, again, these floods causing increased storm overflow, and therefore the drains of sewers often can spill out into the waterways and into the coastal areas. And so we're getting increasing incidences of sewage pollution in our environment. And so there's a group here in the UK called Surfers Against Sewage, who have been organising to kind of raise awareness about these events, but also the fact that they're becoming more frequent as we're getting more intense rainfall events. And just recently, we've had the news about the effects that there have been across Europe this winter, in terms of the extremely warm winter that they've had and the lack of snow as a result. And so many ski resorts have currently, without much snow at all. And this, these temperatures are really shocking from a scientific point of view, but they're having really vivid impacts in terms of whole industries. Tourist industries are being affected as a result. And obviously all the winter sports that go along with that are really negatively affected. And then, these have ripple effects out within the community. So, not only does the fact that there is less snow on the hills in winter affect the tourism, which then affects all other businesses that depend on it, but it also affects agriculture later in the year, because without the snow there to run off in the springtime as it melts, then you don't get that extra amount of water in the spring, early summer, which then nourishes crops. And so you're more likely to see crop failure in the summer as a result of lack of snow. And so it's, again, trying to help people see these connections is a really important part of being able to talk about it. But you can talk about all of this without using kind of graphs or plots. You could just do it with images or about stories and narratives about things that you've witnessed or experienced. And I think being as kind of, we're all now having, I think, or experiencing and seeing these changes in our own lives, and being able to kind of speak to that is a really important thing that we can do. We can also, I think, talk about the kind of, again, the positive things that we're doing and speak out about the changes that we're seeing and being part of, whether or not that's, encouraging people to take up active travel as a way of reducing their carbon footprints, changing their diets, eating more plant-based foods, which kind of have a lower carbon footprint. Or in this case, Forest Green Rovers is trying to be the first low carbon football club, a carbon neutral football club in the world. And this is them showing off their new tour bus, which is electrically charged, for example. And so again, showing how we can take action in our own lives, but also in our communities, how we can speak out for the changes that we want to see, and also increasingly raising our voices further than that and asking for better public infrastructure, such as bike lanes, or challenging fossil fuel sponsorship of sporting events and so on. So these are all things that we can do in order to kind of raise awareness about the things that we want to see in the world. So in terms of our audience and how we can better communicate, I think this is a really helpful way of trying to think about who it is that is most amenable to hearing a message and what it is that we're trying to communicate. So if we think about it as a spectrum of people who are supporting and interested and already active on these issues, and see those as kind of our active allies, and then there's passive allies, who are people who care about these issues, think about them, but perhaps aren't doing anything much about it at the moment. Then there's people who are neutral, really not sure what to think about it. People who are perhaps passively opposed, they don't necessarily agree that they want to see action on these things, but they're not necessarily doing anything to stop it. And then there's kind of the active opposition, who are actively campaigning to kind of slow down change. I would say that we really want to be focusing all our efforts on the first two categories here. Those people who are already active, we want to make sure they stay active and get more involved. And those people who are on the cusp, who already care about these things but don't know what to do and haven't really thought about, how to be more involved. So I would then say, you'd also kind of want to encourage the people who are neutral to become passive allies, and the people who are perhaps passively opposed, you perhaps want to neutralize some of that through your communications. But with the people who are actively opposed, you can pretty much forget about them and ignore them. You're not going to persuade them. That's not the purpose of trying to put your efforts into communicating. I would really stress that we should reach out to the people who are closest to us, who are most ready to take action already. And there's actually a lot of people who are, right? So even in countries that we think of as perhaps slightly more skeptical about taking climate action, such as in the US, we actually find that over half the population is already deeply concerned or alarmed. And very few are kind of dismissive. So, that argument has largely been won to around the world. Here is data for the UK. Similar kind of question, how concerned are you about climate change? And what we can see is that both the red and the kind of pinky color are very concerned and fairly concerned. And we've now reached a point where we're over 80% of the country are saying that they're fairly concerned or very concerned about climate change and want to see action. So, there's a very receptive audience out there to hear this message. And I think sometimes we get worried that we're going to speak out about these things and people are going to oppose us and challenge us on it. But actually, they're a very small minority. And there might be a noisy minority, but we can pretty much safely ignore them. And I think the more of us who do break that silence and start speaking out on a regular basis, that just normalizes it all the more and helps other people feel confident to do so as well. Now, moving on to the kind of point about climate science. Now, I think it's really important to stress, and I'm saying this as someone who's trained as a scientist and has started kind of worked as a climate communicator in this area for a while. We have this idea that if only we can tell people the facts of the science, then they'll know, what to do, and they'll be active. If we just tell them that, this is urgent and so on, that they'll be more likely to take action. That's not how it works. As I said, people are already mostly concerned about these issues. They might not have a great understanding about it, but they kind of know something's wrong and they want to see something done about it. What they're lacking is perhaps a sense of agency and what they can do. And I think, by actually showing the things that we're doing in our own lives and in our own communities and pointing to good examples of that's kind of a way of really enthusing people and giving them something to do. And I think that's more important than kind of banging them over the head with scientific facts. But I do think, as Etienne said, it is important to know like some of these things for ourselves, especially if we're going to go out there and speak about them, in case people, challenge them, and so that we feel that we're confident in what we're saying and why we're saying it. And so this is perhaps more for you to know and feel confident in, rather than for you to necessarily remember to in order to speak out in public about these scientific facts. Yeah, that's the point about this not being a problem about an information deficit necessarily. But if we was to summarize it as 5 things, then as a climate science 101, I would say, the things that you need to know and think about, and everybody should know and feel comfortable in, is that, yes, the climate is warming, and it's warming very rapidly. It's to do with our emissions, so it's us that we're causing it. We're sure about that. It's bad for us and human society, but we can fix it, and there's stuff that we can do. So if you can kind of feel confident in all of that, then you really know all there is to really know about these issues. And fine, there's a lot more kind of science and complexity, but that's not necessarily relevant to the vast majority of people. And this scientific evidence has been accumulated for a really long period of time, and in these massive reports by groups like the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, who synthesize all of this to advise policymakers about the things that they need to take action on. So we've got all of this kind of scientific data that's been synthesized, gone over, peer reviewed again and again, and checked by all of the world's governments, and it's kind of been signed off by every single one of them. So this is probably one of the most robust scientific findings that we've ever managed to put together. And that's because we're not just relying on a few bits of evidence. We can basically, the whole world is changing around us, and there's so many ways in which we can now see those changes. Whether, like I was saying, it's snow cover or glaciers that are melting, or it's the fact that spring is coming earlier in many parts of the world, that sea levels are rising, that we can measure using temperature thermometers, that the temperature in the air and in the oceans is increasing. All of these are signs that the Earth's climate is changing and warming at a rapid pace. So this is a graph from the IPCC report, kind of showing you these different data sets that we've now put together and showing you that, those trends that I was just describing, this is the data behind all of those. And I think one of the things that's just quite helpful to kind of think about is that, often in discussions around kind of science denial and skepticism that there's been in the media, they often kind of focus on a few facts and say, and try and challenge particular things, as though almost if you can just get people to doubt one piece of evidence or show that one piece of evidence is not quite right, then the whole thing will come down like a house of cards, and that climate science is that fragile that if you challenge a little bit of it, the whole thing just falls apart. But it's not like that at all. It's far more like a jigsaw puzzle that's been built up over time. And, yes, there might be a few pieces that are missing or haven't yet kind of been put in the right place. But as a general whole, the picture stays the same. And if you took one piece out, you wouldn't really change our understanding very much, because there's just so many lines of evidence that all point to the same conclusion. And climate science has been built up, as I said, over a really long period of time. The first scientists who really started talking about the greenhouse effect and trying to understand what it was were all the way back in the 1820s. And the first person who really showed that carbon dioxide was a greenhouse gas was John Tyndall in the 1860s. So, we've gradually accumulated this understanding over all that period of time, and we're now very, very confident in it. So yes, it's warming, the Earth's warming, and we're very sure about that. And we know why it's warming as well, right? So it's warming because of the greenhouse effect. Now, the Earth has an atmosphere, and that atmosphere helps keep the planet warmer than it would otherwise be. And it's really important that that's the case. Otherwise, the Earth would be a ball of rock frozen, floating through space. But the gases in the atmosphere do trap some of the heat of the planet and stop it escaping into space, and that therefore keeps the temperature of the planet higher than it otherwise would be. And one of those gases, a really key gas, is carbon dioxide, which we release through burning fossil fuels. Another one is methane, which isn't quite so important, but it's also something that we're changing the concentrations of quite a lot through human activities as well. So generally, we've been increasing the levels of these greenhouse gases year on year for the last 150 years or more. And as a result, the temperature of the planet, as you would expect, is now going up, and temperature is warmed by about 1.2 degrees Celsius. Now, that might not sound like very much, but actually it is a huge amount of extra energy on something the size of a planet. And that energy then changes things like the water cycle, it changes extreme weather events, and melts ice, and can have all sorts of other consequences. So, although the numbers sound small, the amount of energy we're talking about is absolutely staggeringly vast, and these small changes actually can be really significant. So one way of trying to think about it, and I think it's quite helpful to communicate about, is like if we had a fever, and it's only a small temperature increase in your body temperature can have a whole lot of negative effects on your body's organs, right? And it's the same with the planet. So even a small change from what it's normally at can have a really big impacts for ecosystems, and ultimately our societies that depend on the stability of those ecosystems. Now, this is a graph of the emissions of CO2 per year, going back to the 1800s. And as you can see, it's kind of just risen faster and faster. And what this graph shows is that in the yellow, that's half of the world's emissions up until 1988. And then from 1988 to 2014, it's half again. So what we're seeing is that as we're going through time, because we're emitting more and more, half of all the emissions, more than half now, that have ever been emitted have happened since 1988. So that's basically in my lifetime. And that's since the first IPCC reports were published, right? So we're doing this now in the knowledge of what's going to happen. And I find that quite concerning and distressing, really, that we've done as much damage knowingly as we've ever done before. And we know that these emissions are causing climate change, and there's lots of ways we can show that. But we've looked at lots of other things as scientists, right? We've looked at whether it could be natural cycles in the Earth system. We've looked at whether it could be volcanoes. We've looked at whether it could be the sun. And all of these kind of show pretty much a flat line. There's no trend in any of those. Whereas the human emissions and the warming that we'd expect from those has just been going up, and that matches very closely this top graph, which shows you the temperature change over that period of time. So that's one of the ways that we know it's humans that are causing the warming of the planet. So we can also do experiments in our computer models. And this is another way in which we kind of can test this, is that if we run these computer models without human emissions, then we can't recreate the warming that we've seen. But when we put those human emissions into our computer models, then that matches very well the pattern. And that's a way, again, that scientists can use to check and make sure. It's what we call a fingerprint analysis. And there's lots of ways that we can run these kind of fingerprint tests. And so in the same way as we were really confident that the world is warming because of all those different trends I was mentioning, there are lots of different ways that scientists have double checked whether or not we are causing the warming. I think one of the ones that I think is most easy to understand is the fact that nights are warming faster than daytime temperatures. And that happens because if it was the sun that was causing the warming, then we'd expect it to warm faster when the sun was shining on that part of the Earth, which would be the daytime. But because it's the CO2 that's causing the warming, it basically is stopping the heat of the Earth escaping at nighttime back into space. And so we're seeing these temperatures going up faster at night. So we're very, very sure as scientists that it's us that are causing the warming, it's our emissions. But that also means that we know what we have to do to stop it, right? We know that if we stop putting out CO2 and other greenhouse gases, that we can stop the warming. And scientists, like I said, are totally in agreement about this. If you interview climate scientists who are practicing and writing papers in the field, then overwhelmingly more than 97% now of those scientists agree that humans are causing the global warming. This is something that the public don't really know and appreciate, partly because the way that the media talks about it is, again, has historically been, there's this person who says it's happening, this person who says it's not. And so the public kind of think it's kind of 50-50 on average. And this is something that's actually holding us back from taking action because the public feels more unsure about it than the scientists really are. So one of the things that's quite helpful to communicate to the public is the fact that 97% or more of scientists have agreed as a consensus that humans are causing warming. And if more people understood that, then normally we think that means that they'd be more willing to support stronger action. We also know that this is being accepted and endorsed by pretty much every single scientific academy in the world. In the UK, the leading scientific academy is the Royal Society. They put out a statement that's, says very much that humans are causing warming and we need to take action. Same with the Royal Meteorological Society and so on. So there's all of this scientific establishment has studied this data and come to the same conclusion around the world. And that is summarized in this statement in the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change's most recent report published in 2021, that it is now unequivocal that human influence has warmed the atmosphere, oceans, and land. Widespread and rapid changes in the atmosphere, ocean, cryosphere, and biosphere have therefore occurred. And so that's the scientific consensus on this now. And we're sure about this, as we are that tobacco smoke causes cancer. And in the same way as the tobacco companies organized a kind of a misinformation campaign, a denial campaign for a really long time, saying that there was no link between smoking and cancer, the fossil fuel companies have basically orchestrated a very similar campaign. This was a document leaked from the tobacco companies' files where their PR agency basically said, doubt is our product. We're not selling cigarettes, we're selling doubt. And the same is kind of true with fossil fuel companies. They're not selling fossil fuels, they're selling doubt that that we need to stop burning them. This was very much an active part of the strategy of fossil fuels. We still see it happening today with politicians. And this is a quote from a spin doctor in the United States called Frank Luntz, who said that the scientific debate is closing against us, but not yet closed. There is still a window of opportunity to challenge the science. Voters believe that there is no consensus about global warming within the scientific community. If the public come to believe that the scientific issues are settled, their views about global warming will change accordingly. Therefore, you need to continue to make the lack of scientific certainty a primary issue in the debate. So this was a really active strategy to kind of misinform the public and undermine the science. And it was organized, by groups like ExxonMobil, where they would fund various different think tanks and institutions, like the Heartland Institute, the Cato Institute, the Competitive Enterprise Institute, and so on, who would then hire people, talking heads, to go on television, to write op-eds in newspapers, to kind of put out lots of disinformation into the media. And it was very successful at confusing the public and slowing action. And it's one of the reasons that we really need people to speak out against this, and to kind of speak very much more about the need to take action in their own lives. And we've seen, in the UK, there's been a lot of disinformation that's got into the media, not so much nowadays, thank goodness, but here it is in the Daily Express, the Telegraph, the Mirror, and even on the BBC for a long time, they kept on bringing on climate deniers. That's not happening nearly so much now. But one of the things that it's quite helpful to be aware of is the fact that the fossil fuel companies knew about this going all the way back to the 1970s. Their own internal scientific research had made the same conclusions as the scientists have written about in the IPCC reports, right? So this is something from an internal policy document by ExxonMobil scientists written to their senior executives in the 1970s. There is no doubt that increases in fossil fuel usage and decreases in forest cover are aggravating the potential problem of increased CO2 in the atmosphere. So these companies knew what they were doing, and then they lied about it. What we're seeing, I think, much more nowadays is what I would say call discourses of climate delay. Now, this isn't outright denial, but it still serves to slow down and trying to minimize the need to take action. And we see this everywhere, particularly kind of in the form of greenwashing, which is something to kind of really watch out for and to kind of challenge if you spot it. I won't go into this right now. It's a really great blogs. If you look for discourses of climate delay on Google, I'm sure some of those things will come up. But I'll just give you a couple of examples, right? So one of the ones is kind of about redirecting responsibility. So kind of whataboutism is a kind of classic one. So we say, oh, well, we need to take action in the UK to reduce emissions. And people go, well, what about China? Their emissions are much more than the UK's, right? Ignoring the fact that on a per capita basis, we're still emitting more in the UK than they are in China. Or they'll say something like, a technological optimism might be an argument that they say, well, don't worry about it. We don't need to take action right now. We don't need to do anything radical. We'll invent future technologies and they'll solve the problem for us, right? That's not what the science says. The science says we need to take action now. So pushing for these kind of future technologies to fix it, that's kind of a form of delay, and ultimately it's going to harm people. So it's really good to try to understand these discourses of delay. There's 12 of them that have been mapped here, and like I said, you see them everywhere when you know to look for them. So we're really sure the reason that the public don't necessarily understand quite how sure we are is because there's been a massive misinformation campaign that's been pushed for years and years. And it's really bad, right? Like, I'm not going to go into this in huge detail, but I think just as a kind of some of the take-home points, climate change is not simply an environmental issue. It's the point that I started off talking about, right? Yes, it is, as Greenpeace say, the greatest environmental threat humanity's ever faced. It's massively disrupting and destroying habitats and ecosystems around the world, but it's not simply that, right? Climate change is also the biggest human rights issue of the 21st century. It's the biggest global health threat of the 21st century, according to The Lancet, one of the UK's leading medical journals, right? It's also the greatest security threat of the 21st century. It's leading to the possibility of increased conflicts and wars around the world. It's the single greatest threat to sustainable development, said the former UN Secretary General. It's really undermining the progress that we've made in terms of lifting people out of poverty. And as the economist Lord Nicholas Stern said, it is the greatest market failure the world has ever seen, right? This is a huge threat and failure of our economy to properly price in the damage that climate change is causing to our societies. So climate change is not one of these things, right? It's all of them. And therefore, this is the greatest challenge that we're facing as a society this century. And one of the things that I take away from this is that, no matter what you care about, you can find a way that climate change is important to you and the person that you're talking with, because we all care about something that's going to be affected by climate change. And we're all taking part in activities that are contributing to the solutions or the harm that climate change, that's causing climate change. So, we all have a stake in this. We all have something that we care about that's being affected. We all have a way to play a role in its solutions. And that gives us all as communicators a way to kind of talk about climate change that focuses on different parts of this story. And kind of to summarize this, I think, you can't say it any clearer than the UN Secretary General said when the IPCC reports were published recently. Today's IPCC Working Group 1 report is a code red for humanity. The alarm bells are deafening, and the evidence is irrefutable. Greenhouse gas emissions from fossil fuel burning and deforestation are choking our planet and putting billions of people at immediate risk. Global heating is affecting every region on Earth, with many of the changes becoming irreversible. Code red for humanity. I think that's a really useful way of thinking and talking about it. This is also from the IPCC. They say any further delay in concerted anticipatory global action on adaptation and mitigation is the reduction of CO2 emissions, will miss a brief and rapidly closing window of opportunity to secure a livable and sustainable future for all. This is the severity of where we're at now. So it's bad, and I don't think we should ever shy away from saying that. And then finally, what can we do about it? Well, probably the most important thing I think people have to understand is that the more CO2 we put out, the hotter the temperature of the planet will get. Now, the world has set a goal of trying to stay below 1.5 to 2 degrees of global warming. Now, in order to meet that goal, we have only got so much carbon we can burn. It's a carbon budget. So it's the cumulative amount of emissions, right, that will keep us below that temperature. Now, if we started kind of reducing emissions back in 2011, we could have brought emissions down along the green curve, and that would have reached the 2-degree goal. But we didn't, right? If we picked in 2015, we could have brought emissions down along this blue curve, and it would have had to be at 0 by 2045, but we didn't. And we've now reached a point where emissions have gone up in the meantime. So if we peaked around now, we'd have to bring them down even faster in order to make up for the fact that we're carrying on putting emissions out in the meantime. So this rewrites the chronology of climate change, right? It's not about long-term future targets. It's about immediate and urgent radical reductions that have to begin right now. And the longer we wait, the harder it gets, and the more difficult it becomes. And it's because we've delayed for so long that we're now in a kind of a crisis situation where we have to take urgent action. Now, the IPCC's co-chair said it this way, right? It's now or never. If we want to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees C without immediate and deep emissions reductions across all sectors, it will become impossible. So taking action now can move us towards a fairer and more sustainable world. And it's really important to stress that we have all the solutions that we need. We have all the technologies to help us move away from fossil fuels, but we have to stop digging up and burning fossil fuels. That's the overarching challenge of climate change. We can build lots of clean energy, but if we don't use it to switch out fossil fuels, and we just keep adding it on top, then we carry on burning fossil fuels, then the whole problem just keeps getting worse. Okay, so we can fix it. We know what we have to do, but it will take dramatic action, and that has to start right now. And then finally, I've got a few more minutes, so I'm going to go through this as well. I think this is a really helpful way for people, hopefully like yourselves, who are thinking about trying to use your voice, use your platform to speak out about climate change and connect with audiences. And it comes from a professor in the United States who studied how campaigners can talk about climate, about any issue really, called Marshall Gans, and it's called The Story of Self. And it's basically actually 3 stories kind of stitched together in an arc. And you can use this in lots of different ways. You can use it in kind of a short 2-minute pitch, or you could use this to structure a kind of a full long speech that you're giving. It's the same arc that works for all situations. And the 3 stories are the story of self, the story of us, and the story of now. And I'm going to just go through these with a few prompting questions to help you start thinking about how you would tell this story. So the story of self is about you. So you start with yourself, you introduce yourself, you're trying to explain to people why it is that you care about these issues. So why am I called to do this? Why am I speaking out to you right now about the need to take action on climate change? What motivates me? What are the values that I feel are behind that? What makes me and my story unique? And I think it's quite nice to kind of really try and think about that, to kind of think about, when did you start to care about these things? What are the experiences that you've had and the insights that you've got from those experiences that other people don't have? It makes it more human. It brings your story to life. And what's really important is to think about the values, the deep values that are motivating you and underlie your concern. So for me, for example, I might talk about the fact that, I've got this background in science. I'm really motivated around issues about protection of particular environments that I grew up in, or around values of protecting vulnerable people from harm. Perhaps what makes my story unique is my experience going up to the Arctic and studying climate impacts up there firsthand and so on. And it's really important that you then try and link the values that you hold to the values of the group that you're speaking to. So the next part of the story is the story of us. What are the values which distinguish us as a group that we share in common? Where have our values come from? And what is our vision for the world? What's the world that we want to build? What's the better world that we're trying to get to? I guess with if you're talking about sports, you can maybe be talking about community or about excellence or about commitment or those kind of values, right? Things that you can speak to, like what it is about the community that you're reaching out to and why you share those values in common with them. And then finally, with the story of now, we're focusing on the gap between the world as it is right now and the world that we're trying to reach, the one that we want to get to, the one that has our shared vision and values in it. And what is it we can do to make changes that will take us from where we are now to closer to that world that we're trying to reach? And stressing in particular, what is it we need to do right now to create that better world, right? What is the ask that you have of them in order to help get us there? So by putting these three stories together and putting this into an arc, that really helps people, motivate them, mobilize them, get them more involved. And I think it's these kind of stories that we each can tell our own unique story to our own particular communities, but by linking these to our experiences, drawing these connections, helping people connect the dots, helping them see themselves as agents and active, that we can start moving towards taking action. And so hopefully that's going to help you in your own communication efforts. And I'm going to stop there and take any questions.